live then? We're live, okay. All right. Okay, welcome to Ratio Christi. It's week 4, which means, if you can believe it, we're almost a fourth of the way through this semester, including finals week, so it's going fast, although we're still, as you can tell by the snow this morning, we're still in the heart of winter. Anyway, but I got some general announcements for you, like always. If you're new here to Ratio Christi and you don't know that you can keep up with what we do, that means like knowing the weekly topic, what we're going to be discussing each week, such as tonight's topic, who wrote the Gospels. That's sent out on a weekly email every Monday, and you can sign up for that over there on the piece of notepaper on the table if you want to receive that and you don't currently. Also, there's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, places that we post what we're doing, when we're doing it, so you can keep up with what events we're putting on and what's happening. All that information is in those platforms, so that's how you can know what we're doing. Or you can ask us. That's a lot more inconvenient than just having it right in front of you on your computer. So, a couple other regular announcements. Tabling times, we do that in the Union every Tuesday and Wednesday, where we talk to people about our theme for the semester and the big events coming up. You can kind of see the board over there, who wrote the Gospels, was our question yesterday and today at tabling. Every Tuesday, 10:30 to 12:30, and every Wednesday, 11:15 to 1:30 in the City Campus Union, we're tabling, so come join us if you have time and want to do that, and engage in discussions with people walking by about faith, worldview, apologetics, etc. So, we do have our big event coming up. It's the Frank Turek event. Frank Turek, author of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. He's going to be right here in Lincoln at the UNL Union on February 25th at 8 p.m. That's a Tuesday night, just so you're aware, it's a Tuesday night. But invite your friends to come to that. We have a 600-seat capacity. We're inviting multiple churches around town and students on campus. We're announcing it at tabling. So it's going to be a big event. We hope to have a lot of attendance. We're partnering with a lot of organizations. You can pick up this postcard, which we have, has all the information on it, front and back, and you can give this to as many people as you want who you might think might be interested, and then they can have this physical copy and they can know when it's happening. Also, for the semester topic, we have these Is the Bible True ones, these purple ones. These are also to give handout to people who might want to be interested in coming to our meetings like you are here. If you notice, we got the purple one, purple and gold, because LSU won the national championship earlier this year, and red because the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. Interestingly enough, these cards were designed before those events happened. So if you have any sports betting questions, talk to Janae. She'd be very happy to help you with that. Anyway, that was a joke, just being clear. Okay. And then after the Turek event, so the night after on our weekly Wednesday night meeting, that's February 26th, we're going to have a 400-year-old Torah scroll here on display. The reason for that is that, often we think of the Bible as kind of a book we can hold in our hands, neatly bound, written in English, but for thousands of years that wasn't how the Bible existed. It existed on these big scrolls that contained, one or maybe two or multiple books if like the minor prophets were shorter, written in Hebrew or Greek, etc. So we're just going to have a visual here of what the Bible looked like for thousands of years and how it was transmitted and copied. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Invite people to come see that if they want to see a 400-year-old Torah scroll on display. Anyway, in addition to that, I think that is everything that I have to discuss. So, without further ado, we will have Ben Blowers tonight talking about who wrote the Gospels, continuing in our Is the Bible True series.
Well, good. Yeah, Ratio Christi does not endorse any form of gambling or money laundering or any type of criminal activity. But that was a good one, Joel. I like that. So I'm excited here to dive into the authorship of the Gospels and the evidence for, as I believe, the early dating of that authorship. But I figured we'd start off with a recap of the last 3 semesters. I know we've got some people who weren't here maybe for the first couple, or for those watching online, we'd love to have you go back and look at those. So if you aren't familiar or if you need a refresher, here's what we covered the last 3 weeks. So the first week, Adam covered what Jesus said about the Old Testament, making an argument that Jesus said it had divine authority, it had imperishability, infallibility, and inerrancy, distinguishing between those. Historical reliability. Then Adam talked about the scientific accuracy and ultimate supremacy. These are all things that Jesus claimed or indicated through the way that he utilized the Old Testament. These are things that Jesus claimed about that. Then 2 weeks ago, Adam helped us develop a framework for understanding which books belong in the New Testament. Now, he didn't necessarily make an argument for which books are in the New Testament, but he said here, if we're going to evaluate what should be in the New Testament, this is how we should go about that. And he premised the argument this way. He said, how do we know which messages are from God? And then argued that only the books that the apostles affirmed or said were messages from God themselves, only those books should be included in the New Testament. Okay? And then last week, Wesley had an excellent topic covering which gospels, which books were excluded or regarded as heretical, excluded from the New Testament, and the reasons why. And he kind of ran it through a battery of 3 questions, and then evaluated a number of gospels against those questions. And those questions were, if you can remember, was the gospel affirmed by an apostle of God? Was the gospel communicated, or was it communicating the truth of God? And then was it collected, or was this gospel collected by the people of God? Right? And so he demonstrated a number of gospels that were rejected outright or called out as heresy, and pointed out the Gnostic influences in many of them, or the fact they were falsely attributed to apostles or other people who were alleged to be around Jesus when he was here on earth, and was able to, I think, give a very compelling argument for the fact that those gospels were not included in the New Testament. Okay? So, tonight we're going to be looking at who wrote the Gospels and looking at basically the dating, authorship, and theme of the Gospel real quickly, and then diving into this question here. Is there good evidence that the Gospels were affirmed by the apostles and the early church as messages from God? Okay, is there good evidence that the apostles thought that the Gospels that we have now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were messages from God, and what is that evidence? Where would we go to find that? Okay, but before we get into that, I'd like to get the discussion going here quickly. So I want you to consider this question at your tables right off the bat. Does it concern you that the 4 gospel authors did not identify themselves outright? Okay, that may be new information to some of you. Kind of assume that, well, the title is the Gospel of according to John or the Gospel according to Matthew. But none of the Gospels are actually start out saying, I, Luke, wrote this Gospel, and therefore it's truthful, or anything like that. So is that concerning to you? Talk at your tables. Why is that concerning, or why isn't that concerning to you? So go ahead and have a few discussions, and then I'll draw it back in just to get your minds thinking about how we're going to move into this topic. So go ahead. sounded like there was some debate as to whether this was a problem, or was it natural for the writings of this time to not be attributed, or things like that. So it's encouraging to see that this is where your mind's going, because this is where we're headed here. But what we're going to do is we're going to start out not with the Gospel of Matthew. I'm not going to go in the traditional chronological order of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I'm going to go in the order, full disclosure, I take a more conservative, or a more of an early dating position on the writing of the Gospels. I seem to be, as I've studied through this issue, the weight of evidence does appear to be, to me, on the side of the early dating. I know there are respected scholars who would disagree and place the dating later, but I'm going to be working from an early dating framework and making a case for that. And in light of that, I'm going to start with the earliest gospel, or roughly the earliest gospel that would have been written within that framework. Okay? And that gospel, does anyone know off the top of their head what the first gospel most scholars, or a lot of scholars, believe was written? Mark. You got it. Yeah, so Mark is where we're going to start. And here's just a little bit about the book of Mark itself. It was written, given the early dating, it was written sometime mid to late 50s by John Mark, is the traditional author that's attributed to. John is actually the Hebrew name. He was a Hellenistic Jew, so Greek by language, by outlook, by the way that he lived, fully invested in the Greek culture, but was not Greek in ancestry. That's what Hellenistic means. So John's Hebrew name, or Mark's Hebrew name, was John, paired together with his Greek, John Mark. He was a relative of Barnabas, which was a very well-known New Testament character, a companion of Paul for a time. I believe Mark and Barnabas were either cousins or uncle and nephew. It's a little unclear from the manuscripts, but they're understood to be relatives. And then the theme of Mark throughout the book, and this is more of a theological point just for your information, the theme of Mark is understood to be very simply that Mark was making the case that Jesus was the Son of God. And then he also has themes of Jesus' servanthood, the fact that he came to serve others. He didn't come to rule over and enslave, or exert power over people, but he came to serve. So that's one of the main, very broad themes of the Gospel of Mark. And then the audience was to the Gentiles in Rome. Okay? So just a little bit of the kind of bird's eye view of traditionally what Mark has been understood to be in the background. Well, we're going to move into the evidence for this early authorship. And we're going to look at Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis. Throughout the evening, we're going to get a whole bunch of Greek names. I'm going to do my best to pronounce them, but man, they use a lot of letters in these names, so bear with me. But Hierapolis was I found this interesting. It was an ancient city. It was abandoned, I think, somewhere around the 4th century, but it's in the modern day Turkey, but it was known for its hot springs and baths. A lot of people would actually go there to retire. So an interesting fact about Hierapolis. But this is where Papias served as bishop until around AD 130. And Papias, we don't know a lot about him other than the fact that he was a bishop. We know roughly that he lived from AD 70 to AD 163, somewhere around there, and that he was a companion of Polycarp, who we'll talk about later. But that's about it. We don't have a whole lot of other historical information about Papias. But as Papias wrote or was recorded as saying about when talking about the Gospel of Mark, he said this: "And the presbyter used to say this," and here Papias is quoting, "Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order, the things that said or done by the Lord." So in other words, Mark here is quoting the presbyter, or the teacher, the elder, generally understood by scholars to be the Apostle John. So here, Papias is quoting, or being quoted about Mark, and this quote actually comes from Eusebius, who lived much later, but he was an early church historian, wrote the Historia Ecclesiastica. So the church, the history of the church, right? So this was a document that Eusebius put together. Here he quotes Papias, who was quoting the Apostle John about the writing of Mark. Okay? So if you can follow that family tree, the kind of complex family tree, here John is saying that Mark was Peter's interpreter and was the author of much of what Peter taught and said about Jesus. Okay? So Papias gives us some very early evidence. Again, he lived somewhere 70 to 160. So this would have been well within the time frame of even the life of John, as far as we can tell. But we also know that Mark had a very close relationship with Peter. We can see this from the gospel itself. But we can also look at Acts. I won't have you pull out your Bibles or Bible apps or anything. But in Acts 12, we actually find out that Peter, when he escaped from prison, actually went to Mark's mother's home for shelter for a time. Mark's family was understood to be fairly wealthy, landowners, and Peter actually went there for a time. Peter refers to Mark as my son in 1 Peter chapter 5. And then Justin Martyr, in referencing, and these are all names you're going to hear a lot through the rest of the evening. Justin Martyr lived about AD 100 to 165. He referred to it as the Memoirs of Peter. So here he's confirming or adding additional evidence to the authorship of the Gospel of Mark and attributing it, saying, okay, it's got the apostolic authority or apostolic affirmation, starting to make that indication that Peter is the scribe, or may have had some scribal training as an interpreter for Peter, but he links this book directly to Peter. And then Mark also begins in the first chapter and ends in chapter 16 mentioning Peter, but interestingly here, and this is going to really play a part in this next piece of evidence, Mark makes no mention of Peter's travel to Rome, where he ended up dying, or any of the circumstances surrounding Peter's death. So for someone who traveled with Paul, traveled with Peter some, and was in Rome for a time while Peter was there, to essentially be writing the memoirs of Peter, to miss out on something like the death, the martyrdom of Peter, which is one of the most well-attested martyrdoms of the apostles, as Sean McDowell notes. For him to miss out on that seems to be something key, something we need to notice. The best explanation, I think, for that absence of something of information like that would be that it hadn't happened yet. The end of Mark actually ends with Peter and Jesus having a conversation, and they are still in Jerusalem or nearby, and we know that Peter from church history was martyred in Rome. Mark leaves those things out, and so it seems plausible that they hadn't happened yet. This is going to play into this next piece of evidence for the early authorship of Mark, which is what I'm referring to as the argument from the book of Acts. Okay, so here we're going to do some somewhat investigative work. Follow along with me. Ask any questions if I am not clear in here. But I'll just list this out for you. So Luke has a significant interest. The author of Luke has a significant interest in Jerusalem, mentioning Jerusalem approximately 30 times in the Gospel of Luke and around 60 times in the book of Acts. Okay? Nowhere in either Luke or Acts is there any mention of the destruction or the siege of Jerusalem, which happened mid-60s, the destruction of the temple, which happened in AD 70, or the persecution under Nero, again in the mid-60s, or the death of Paul, Peter, or James, which happened. We have strong historical evidence that those three martyrdoms happened between 62 and 67. Okay? There's no mention of that at all. But the author of Acts records lesser-known martyrdoms like Stephen, James, and a few others. Okay? Again, the argument here being the fact that these significant players in the New Testament, Peter, James, and Paul, the fact that their martyrdoms are not mentioned or any of these significant events. Imagine writing a history of let's say New York City, right? Or maybe New Orleans. And if you're writing a history of New Orleans, right, up to date, and you leave out Hurricane Katrina, right, you would one, be laughed at, and everyone would be incredulous at how could you leave something that important out of the city's history, right? Here we have the gospel writer and then the author of Acts leaving out something even more significant, because Jerusalem wasn't simply a particular city, but it was the center of an entire ethnicity and religious system. Okay, it was the center, and having the destruction of the temple not even mentioned is very significant. So we can then look at the introductions to both Luke and Acts. Acts begins, I've written my first letter to you, Theophilus. Now I'm writing my second letter, essentially, rough paraphrase. So we know that then Luke was written prior to Acts, which would push it. So we've got the deaths of, say, Peter, Paul, and James at AD 62 to 67. The writing of Acts would have been, as the argument goes, sometime before that. Maybe we'll say a couple years, right, to allow for the dissemination, copying, and people becoming familiar with that book. So a couple years, say AD 60 or 61. A couple years before that, again, we've got the writing of Luke. So the argument goes, and then Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, Luke mentions that many others have set out to write an account. I'm setting out to write an orderly account, which most scholars would understand to be a reference to Mark's Gospel. All right, because Mark's Gospel wasn't written down in any. It's fairly. It's not chronologically in order, right? It's fairly unorganized. It seems to be just a collection of memoirs or collections of writings that were put down, but there's not a lot of structure. The Greek is okay, but it's not highly advanced Greek writing. And so Luke says in the beginning of Luke, I'm setting out to write an orderly gospel, right? So we're already at, say, 58 to 60 for the writing of Luke, which would then push the writing for Mark's gospel to around the mid-50s. Okay? Does that one make sense? There's a complicated or fairly complex working backwards to figure out when we can reasonably date the writing of Mark. One of the other arguments for the early dating of Mark is that Matthew and Luke both appear to use significant portions of verses from Mark's gospel. Andreas Kostenberger here quoted Karl Lachmann, who was a German textual critic. And here's your $50 word for the night, okay? I threw this in partly because it was just fun, but it lends well to the point we're making here for early dating. Karl Lachmann said this: the chronological order of the pericopes in Matthew and Luke, and a pericope is simply an excerpt from a text, okay, and generally referencing a biblical text is generally the context. So a pericope. The pericopes in Matthew and Luke is very similar, and when Mark contains the pericope. And the order of the pericopes in Matthew and Luke is often different if Mark does not contain the pericope. Lachmann also notes that Matthew and Luke never agree in chronological order against Mark. Okay, so the argument here, if you can kind of pull apart this quote here, is that when Mark has a particular order of text, and Matthew and Luke have those same pericopes or those same excerpts, they follow the same order that Mark does. But if you take Matthew and Luke together and you look at the order of pericopes or the order of these excerpts of text that Mark does not have, they're in different order, but they never agree together against Mark. Are you tracking with me? This is some deep level textual criticism here. But what that indicates, scholars believe, is that Mark was used as a source and predates both Matthew and Luke. You would assume if Matthew and Luke were pulling from a different source, as there's a theory of the Q document, which we won't get into, some theoretical document that all three of these gospel writers used as a source, you would think that they would sometimes agree in order of the verses or of the text against Mark, but that never happens, indicating that I think a strong or a very plausible answer or explanation that they both utilized Mark as a source for Matthew and Luke, therefore giving Mark an early dating. All right, and then Mark also developed, and these are just some smaller, or I would say less weighty arguments for the early dating and the authorship of Mark. But Mark provides less developed theology. In other words, he doesn't sit there and develop these theological explanations, or he doesn't deal with theological themes so much, and like I said, is fairly disorganized. I think indicative of what you would expect when having someone write down your memories as you're speaking, right? Or Mark is remembering what Peter has dictated to him, or Peter's dictating just kind of off the top of his head, and there was this moment when Jesus said these things, and then he went over and healed this person, and it may not be entirely in order. Mark also seems to protect key individuals. This is an interesting one. An example there is Mark 14:47, where Mark does not name, so this is the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And if you remember that story, Peter actually pulls out a sword when the soldiers come to take Jesus, pulls out a sword, slices off the ear, which has always baffled me. You know, how good or bad do you have to be to aim at somebody's head and only get the ear? But there's a story here where both Peter and the servant are named. They're named in other Gospels. Mark withholds their names. Certainly, if he had had this close relationship with Peter, he would have known. Peter would have been like, yeah, I did that. But Mark seems to withhold that name. And again, scholars, there's some debate on this, but scholars suggest that this was because it may have put Peter and others in the church in danger. Remember, there was persecution going on virtually from the first couple years after Jesus' resurrection. Okay? So again, Mark seems to be offering evidence that this was happening during a time of persecution when he's still protecting the identity of some. And then lastly, no alternative author to the Gospel of Mark has ever been put forward, at least for our memory. In the church history, there has been no other alternative author that's been proposed for the Gospel of Mark. We're going to look at the end, kind of have an overview of all of the ancient writers who attributed Mark to the Gospel of Mark to John Mark as the author. But no author has ever been uncovered to have been, oh no, this was actually James, or this was Bob, from down the street. So these are some of the evidences that I think lend themselves very strongly to an early dating, which part of the reason I'm focusing on the early dating is because Mark would have been living during this time, right? Mark was, some scholars think that Mark may have even died before Peter. I found that in one I think Donald Hagner, who's a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, made that suggestion. He makes an argument that Mark may have died prior to Peter's death. But Mark would have been able to access the memory of Peter, talk to him. He would have been able to talk to and hear from other disciples throughout the early church, thereby giving him credibility in what he wrote. There would have been accuracy. There's no reason for myth or legend or inaccuracies to creep in or be developed by the Christian community before Mark got to writing his gospel. Okay? So here's actually a fragment entitled P137. P stands for papyrus. This is just the way that scholars will document various fragments that are uncovered at archaeological digs. This is the earliest fragment of the Gospel of Mark that we have to date. The double-sided nature, you can see it's been flipped over, so you're seeing the front and the back side here, indicates that it was part of a codex, which was the early precursor to a book, right? So they would take this papyrus, they would bind it with usually animal strings or other types of things to compile it into an early form of a book, writing on both sides of the papyrus. The scholars have dated this fragment roughly to AD 150 to 250, which sounds like a long time ago, and that's a wide range. But given the challenges of trying to date a text like this, I can't remember the dimensions. I believe it's something like 4 or 5 centimeters across, a very small fragment. It was found in a garbage dump, if I remember correctly. So the document here contains the letters from Mark 1 to 7 on the front. Mark 1, 7 to 9, and the back letters, or the back side of the fragment contains letters and words from Mark 1, 16 to 18. And Bart Ehrman actually translated this. He offered his own translation. And you'll recognize it. I'll read it here. He said, the front starts off, "Of his sandals I baptize you in water, but he will baptize you in the Holy Spirit. And it happened in those days," and then it trails off. And then the back has these words, "In the sea, for they were fishers. And he said to them, 'Come after me, and I will make you fishers of people.' And immediately, leaving their nets," and then it trails off. So that's actually what the Greek here on this fragment is translated as, very clearly or recognizably part of Mark's gospel. So I thought this was interesting. I'll be showing you some other fragments here throughout the night. But moving on to Matthew. So Matthew is understood to be the next in chronological order of writing. Matthew is generally understood to be the next gospel that was written. In the 50s or 60s, author is traditionally attributed to Matthew, who was understood to be a disciple of Christ, Jewish tax collector, so not very popular among his fellow Jews. And the book itself is highly organized and actually talks more about money than any of the other gospels. Not a strong piece of evidence for the fact that Matthew is the author, but an interesting fact nonetheless. The theme highlights Jesus as Messiah, and also the fact that he was the King of the Jews. So the lineage that Matthew gives, the genealogy of Matthew, emphasizes the kingly lineage that Jesus had. And the audience was understood to be primarily Jewish, although we're not exactly sure to whom he was writing. So some of the early evidence, again, going back to Papias said this: "Therefore, on the one hand, Matthew arranged in order the sayings in the Hebrew dialects, and on the other hand, each translated these as he was able." Now, there is some ambiguity as to exactly what this quote means in its entirety, but that ambiguity in translation is more due to which language Matthew was originally written in. But that's going to be an issue that we're going to leave aside for the rest of the evening, just beyond the scope of our topic here tonight. But again, Papias, who lived 80-70 to 125, I believe, said this about Matthew. Sean McDowell notes that Papias also recorded that Matthew wrote his book, quote, "while Peter and Paul were preaching and founding the church in Rome." So now remember, we talked earlier about when Peter and Paul, who are the two most well-attested martyrdoms, we have the most historical evidence. Sean McDowell wrote his dissertation on the martyrdom of the apostles. If you're interested, I actually have it over here on the book. He gave the martyrdom of Peter the most highly probable rating, which is the highest rating of historical confidence that he could give to the facts surrounding Peter's death, and Paul was right up there, I believe, at the same rating. And Peter and Paul were martyred roughly between AD 64, AD 67. Okay, so if we know that Peter and Paul spent time in jail prior to their martyrdom, which would then push the establishing or the preaching of the gospel and founding the church in Rome, like Papias recorded, we would have to push that a few years earlier. And Matthew here Papias tells us that's when he wrote the gospel. Okay? And then we can look at something interesting here. So remember, there's not a lot of strong evidence. Well, let me rephrase that. Not all scholars are convinced that Matthew was the tax collector. Okay? There is some disagreement there. But there's this interesting piece of information. Luke, Mark, and Matthew all recount the story of when the religious leaders came to Jesus, asking if they should pay taxes, trying to trap him, right, getting him in trouble with the Roman leaders. And Luke and Mark, interestingly, use the term denarion, where Matthew uses the more precise term nomisma, which means state coin. This is a piece of information I think would plausibly suggest that the writer of Matthew had a deeper understanding, or maybe a more thorough understanding of what type of coin, or would have remembered to make that type of distinction. If it is the case that Matthew was a tax collector, he would have been very familiar with the different forms of currency and the reasons for using this particular term. But that's an interesting piece of information that Matthew has, that or word that Matthew uses that Mark and Luke do not. Matthew also includes the story of Jesus and Peter paying temple tax. And there were some other instances of Matthew recording Jesus talking about finances or talking about money, more so than the other Gospels. Again, not a strong piece of evidence, but one that at least plausibly suggests that Matthew, the tax collector, was the author of this gospel. The early church was unanimous in its affirmation of the gospel. They didn't question the authorship. They understood it to be Matthew, the disciple of Christ, the tax collector. And this idea, or this belief, was not really even seriously challenged, until the late 19th century, when textual criticism became more in fashion or in vogue. So there wasn't really any question about the authorship of Matthew raised until very recently. Again, all of these things put together seem to build a strong case, I would argue, for the early dating of the Gospel of Matthew, but then also the authorship that it was indeed Matthew, the disciple of Christ. Okay, and remember, our question that we're answering is there enough evidence, or is there good evidence for the apostles affirming the Gospels as part of the New Testament? And indeed, I think we could strongly argue that if an apostle wrote the Gospel, then he would certainly affirm it as part of the New Testament. So that's the case we're making. Here I've got the P64 Gospel of Matthew fragments, roughly dated to AD 50 to AD 175. So that's some of the early scholarship, but potentially written as late as a little ways into the 200s. But this would have been while Irenaeus, the disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp was living around 130 to 200 as well. So this actually would have been written. So here, so Peter had Polycarp as his disciple. Disciple then had Irenaeus as a disciple. Papias, remember, we've quoted him a couple times, was a companion, a friend of Polycarp, right? Polycarp and Papias knew John personally, as far as we can tell. This fragment would have been written while Irenaeus was living. So essentially one generation removed from John himself, who would have known Matthew and was there for the events of Jesus' life. Again, the double-sided nature, you can see the different verses there. The double-sided nature indicates that this is part of a codex again. And they've actually discovered, and this blows my mind, right? So you've got these small little fragments of this papyrus. They were able to identify this fragment, P64, as being written by the same scribe that also wrote a fragment P4 and P67. Okay, so there are 5 other fragments They have 3 here, and then these other 2 fragments, all written by the same scribe, but they were able to determine that P4 was not part of this codex. P67 was. So this was actually, they've gotten fragments from the same codex that they've been able to identify. So something fascinating, I think, that these scholars can look at the text and be able to identify even the handwriting of a particular scribe. But looking here a little more modernly, Andreas Kostenberger, we've got, I think, Adam, you've got the book back here. This is one that Adam's recommended a couple times. Fantastic resource. I used it in preparation for tonight. But he said this: modern readers may confidently affirm Matthew's authorship of this gospel and recognize it as a testimony to the life of Jesus, written by both an eyewitness and an apostle, thereby giving it strong affirmation as part of the New Testament. D.A. Carson Douglas Moo also said, it must be said that at one level very little hangs on the question of the authorship of this gospel. By and large, neither its meaning, and this is important, neither its meaning nor its authority is greatly changed if one decides that its author was not an apostle. The evidence is so overwhelming that the early church fathers, other apostles, other leaders in the church believed this to be written by Matthew and, more importantly, affirmed as part of the New Testament, part of God's Word. They said even if it turns out that Matthew didn't write this book, the meaning and authority don't change very much at all. So again, we're looking at authorship as something that's a high standard. If we can identify authorship of a gospel, man, that gives us a real strong confidence in the affirmation that the apostles would have had. But in this case, the evidence is so strong as it being part of the New Testament, even if the authorship, even if we do have all this information wrong about Matthew's writing of this gospel, it doesn't change the authority. Pretty powerful stuff. So I'm going to stop talking here, give you a chance to digest a little bit. This has been a lot of information. This is kind of the bulk of the talk because Mark is such an important piece of information, having to go through the Acts argument. So I'm going to throw out a question here. Do you find the evidence for the dating and authorship of Mark and Matthew to be convincing? And then why or why not? Spend a little bit of time talking about that. Yeah.
Did you hear the thing about the guy who dated the people in University of Nebraska?
No.
Yeah, it's a guy named Dirk Elbring, but he doesn't have the wrong Oxford. He was born and raised in Christian.
How about that?
Yeah, I know.
Fascinating.
Trump elected something, but that's not interesting.
That's awesome. All right, guys, let's bring it back in. I know that this is a little harder because it sounds like there's some heated discussion going on here. But we're going to go ahead and move forward here from Mark and Matthew into the Gospel of Luke, looking at the evidence for Luke's authorship and the dating here. So again, real quickly, early 50s to early 60s is again the dating that many scholars will take. There is some disagreement again. Lycona, Ehrman would take a later dating for this book as well. But again, using that argument about the absence of the temple or the martyrdoms of some early church fathers seems to indicate an earlier writing of Acts and then therefore Luke. A few things we know about Luke. He was a physician. He was a companion and dear friend. Paul actually refers to Luke as a dear friend in Colossians 4:14. But he traveled with Luke on a number, or for a number of years on Paul's missionary journeys. Luke was also a highly educated. Being a physician, this would have been kind of closer to the upper echelon of education in this time in history. And then the theme of Luke is communicating the humanity of Christ, right? He doesn't spend so much time building a case for the kingship of Christ or for the fact that Jesus was the Son of God. He more focuses on Jesus' humanity and the things that he did, emphasizing things like Jesus' sorrow with Lazarus and so on. He was writing specifically to Theophilus, but more broadly to Greeks in general. Luke's gospel was disseminated throughout much of the Greek part of the world. So here we're actually going to get into the text of Luke a little bit, and this isn't, the argument I want you to understand that I'm not making is that because Luke says these things, therefore it's true, therefore we know the Bible is true, right? That would be a circular argument. That's not the argument that I'm making, but we can look to the text of Luke to understand some things about Luke's authorship. If we were looking at, say, Homer's Odyssey or any other early document, maybe a document written by Aristotle, were we to stumble across a new document and it says, I, Aristotle, have penned these words, we would take it on its face, unless given good reasons against this, to say, okay, we're reading a text that Aristotle actually wrote, or maybe wrote an original manuscript. We don't have that with the Gospel of Luke, but we do have some clues within the Gospel. So again, I'm not going to read these scriptures out, the passages. I would encourage you to write them down, look them up, because this is making the case that the author is the same for both Luke and Acts, referring to himself as, in the first book, I dealt with all the things that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up, referring to his ascension into heaven. But scholars are generally in agreement, even referring to these two books as Luke Acts. They refer to it almost as a single book. We can safely claim that the same author wrote both of these books, and so we can use Acts to learn a little bit more about who Luke was. I'll just remind you again about this argument from Acts. I think it's very compelling as to give us a good argument for the dating of Luke writing the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. But then going on beyond that, we can look at the structure of the book of Luke and of Acts. Both of them are highly organized, very thorough. Luke even says himself that I'm setting out to write an orderly account. Remember, referencing, most scholars believe, Mark's disorderly account. I'm going to write an orderly account, and I'm going to interview people. I've talked to eyewitnesses, many of whom are still alive today. So essentially saying, if you don't believe me, you can check this out for yourself. For those of you who watched or listened to Adventures in Odyssey, I don't know, a few of you maybe, there was a saying that John Avery Whitaker would say at the beginning of all of those episodes. He'd say, well, don't take my word for it. find out for yourself on today's Adventures in Odyssey, and then go into the episode, right? Luke is essentially kind of saying that. He's like, if you don't believe me, you can find out for yourself by talking to these many witnesses that I've interviewed to see if what I say here is true. But we can also go on to the external evidence. So Marcion was a heretic, came up with a lot of pretty crazy theological doctrines that he developed and was called out by a number of different early church fathers. But even with those doctrinal issues, Marcion identifies Luke as the author of both Acts and the Gospel. Irenaeus and Tertullian both attribute authorship to Luke, and note specifically that Tertullian was a companion of Paul and a doctor. So not only do they say Luke wrote both of these books, but he was a companion of Paul and a doctor. So building a case here for the authorship. And then Justin Martyr says this, for in the memoirs, which I say were drawn up by his apostles and those that followed them, it is recorded that Jesus' sweat and tears fell like drops of blood while he was praying and saying, quote, if it be possible, let this cup pass. That text there and the reference to Jesus sweating drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane are pulled directly from Luke, and Justin Martyr here references or uses this text, this reference, as Scripture. He seems to be quoting it authoritatively as Scripture, recognizing it. I believe I've got later on the slide when exactly Justin Martyr was living, but it was a couple hundred years after Jesus' life here on earth at the latest. And he, even at that point, was regarding Luke's gospel as authoritative New Testament scripture. And then finally we have the Bodmer Papyrus, or P75, which we've got a picture of here. This is a fascinating document that actually records, it has on the inscription, I wish I couldn't find anything that said exactly where it says this on the document, but it actually has the inscription according to Luke. It attributes this document, this writing, to Luke, who is the companion of Paul, in the title. Scholars estimate that it was written sometime between AD 175 and 225. So again, fairly early, fairly recent after the events that Luke records. That's when this document was written. Again, while Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, was alive, and it was also part of a codex. If you're curious, the parts of Scripture or the parts of the Gospel of Luke that are contained on this document, it's quite a broad range. It's got verses all the way from about 3:18, Luke 3:18, all the way up to 24, verse 51. And then it also has portions of John, the introduction to John as well. So again, remember this is part of a codex, so they would have been writing similar to how we have a book now, front and back. And so when they got done with the Gospel of Luke, they start writing the Gospel of John right after it. So there's some of the evidence for the Gospel of Luke, both internal from the text that we can pull out, the markers or the indicators that suggest Luke is the author, but then also looking at other sources not affiliated or not directly knowing the person of Luke. D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo again said this: the universal identification of a non-apostle as the authority of almost 1/4 of the New Testament. So Luke is a significant portion of the New Testament, totaling about 25% of the volume of the New Testament writing. The author of almost 1/4 of the New Testament speaks strongly for the authenticity of the tradition. In other words, the fact that Luke is universally identified as the author adds credibility to the authority or the apostolic affirmation that the gospel enjoys. There's no need, this is key, so remember last week looking at how these other gospels attributed themselves, hey, this is the gospel of Thomas, this is the gospel of Mary, trying to gain credibility from themselves. The Gospel of Luke says there was no need to attribute it to an apostle because it was already understood to have that apostolic affirmation or the authority of Scripture. There was no need to attribute the book to anyone else to garner additional credibility. Okay, so Carson and Moo here make a strong case, and I can point you to where they flesh that case out. But they make a strong case that this actually lends a high level of confidence that we can have in the fact that Luke wrote this gospel. And then finally, we get to turn to the gospel according to John, right? This was interesting. D.A. Carson said that almost any date between AD 55 and AD 95 is possible as to the writing of this book. He said none of the arguments for a more precise date is entirely convincing. So there are some scholars who are going to say it's much later, even as late as 100, or very early, in the early 60s. But Carson suggested that he's like, if I can make a modest suggestion, it's probably, my guess would be AD 80 to 85. Somewhere in a 5-year time span, kind of in the middle of that, was his best guess. But John is considered to be, by most scholars, the latest gospel to be written. It's referred to by some as the fourth gospel. Looking at the evidence here, the Gospel of John is filled with references to the beloved disciple, or the disciple that Jesus loved. John 21 has this. This is at the end of the chapter. So Jesus and the beloved disciple and Peter are talking. Peter and Jesus are actually having a conversation. And Peter points to the beloved disciple and says, "What about him?" And the author, or the text says, makes this argument, references the beloved disciple, and then says, "This is the disciple bearing witness who has written these things." Okay, so the beloved disciple is the one who has written these things. And then further on, later in that passage, says, "Were everything to be written down, I suppose," and then makes his argument. So he goes from the beloved disciple, the author goes from the beloved disciple to the beloved disciple is the one writing these things, to I. Okay? So there's a fairly strong case to be made that the beloved disciple is the author of the book of John. And then in John 1:14, again, you get some first person pronouns here for you grammar geeks, where the author says, "The Word dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory." And Kostenberger, Andreas Kostenberger, who I mentioned before, makes a strong argument that from multiple passages throughout the gospel, one can deduce that John is the best possible option. He goes through numerous cases where this is referenced, where the beloved disciple is referenced in conjunction with multiple other disciples, offers an argument why other disciples are not the author of the gospel, and the best explanation is that the beloved disciple is the author, and that the beloved disciple was John. Okay, using some evidence from the other gospels as well. But again, just like with Matthew when we talked about, even if we're wrong about John being the author, the text makes clear that the author was an apostle. Even if we have misattributed it to John, the text makes clear that the author was an eyewitness. Key, if you remember last semester's topic looking at the deity of Christ, answering who is Jesus, eyewitness accounts are very valuable in establishing credibility, and the author of John was an eyewitness and a disciple of Jesus. So these three facts are well established from the text itself, even if we have misattributed the authorship. But there's good argument to say that we haven't misattributed. Irenaeus says this: John, the disciple of the Lord, who leaned back on his breast. Remember at the Last Supper, there was John references, or the author of John references, there was the beloved disciple leaning against Jesus' chest. Irenaeus identifies him as John. He says, the disciple of the Lord who leaned back on his breast published the gospel while he was a resident at Ephesus in Asia. So Irenaeus was kind of the latest date that we have, or we're working back in the timeline here, working back here in these attributions. in chronology. So Irenaeus says that John was the one who published the gospel. Clement, at an earlier date, says John, last of all, composed the spiritual gospel. They're indicating that all three of the other gospels had already been written. Then Theophilus of Antioch was the first writer to unambiguously quote from the Gospel of John and attribute that quotation to the Apostle John. So he was the first one. These other two said that, but they were later. Theophilus was the first person to quote from the Gospel and attribute that to John. But then Tatian, Claudius, Apollinarius, and Athenagoras, I think I'm saying that right, all clearly quoted from John authoritatively as Scripture. So they didn't necessarily say John the Apostle or the Apostle John said, fill in the blank, but they quoted from John's Gospel as Scripture, putting it on equal footing with other Scriptures. And then lastly, or I should say firstly, Polycarp via Irenaeus. Polycarp was quoted as saying, Irenaeus is quoted here saying, I remember the events of those days more clearly than those which have happened recently. I can even speak of the place in which the blessed Polycarp sat, how he reported in his converse, I didn't know they had converse back then, how Polycarp reported in his converse with John and with others who had seen the Lord, how he remembered their words, including Jesus' miracles, teaching, and how Polycarp had received from them, the eyewitnesses, the word of life. So Irenaeus is recorded as remembering Polycarp and the fact that Polycarp talked with John. He was a disciple of John who had seen the miracles, the eyewitnesses. So here's the last fragment we get to look at tonight. This is the P52 John Rylands fragment. Excuse me. This is, by most scholars, understood to be the earliest dated fragment that we have of any New Testament text. Bart Ehrman dates it to 81. Bart Ehrman dates this to 125 to 30, plus or minus 25 years. So Bart Ehrman seems to be comfortable with even a dating for this writing all the way to 100, AD 100. So very much during the life of people who knew John, who maybe even copied this from John's Gospel, some of the original manuscripts. That's a possibility given the dating. The front verses, or the front parts, have verses from John 18:31 to 33, and the back have verses from parts of verses from John 18:37 to 38. So again, a codex, part of a codex, double-sided writing here, but a fascinating piece of history. There was some discussion here, in the last couple of years, Adam, about the Mark the Mark fragment being earlier dating, but then it was dismissed as not the earliest. It was actually given a later dating, still very early, but there were some rumors initially that were floating around that it could have been a first century document. Turned out not to be. This still holds the first place as the earliest document that we have of the New Testament. So there's kind of there's the in-depth version or the in-depth look at the evidence for early dating and authorship. So again, as with Mark and Matthew, what do you think about the convincing of Luke, or the authorship and dating of Luke and John? Is the evidence convincing? What do you think? Discuss that for a little bit, and we'll come back and wrap up here. Guys, let's go ahead and bring it in. We'll wrap up here and then get on with the evening. Good conversations. So here's where we're going to wrap up. I've got a quote here and then just a broad overview. F.F. Bruce, who was a British scholar, New Testament scholar, said this: "It is noteworthy that while the four canonical Gospels could afford to be published anonymously, the apocryphal Gospels, which began to appear from the mid-2nd century onwards, claimed falsely to be written by apostles or other persons associated with the Lord. If the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would generally be regarded as beyond all doubt." Okay? He's saying here, if the level of evidence we have for the authorship of the Gospels was put towards any other historical document from around this same time, there would virtually be no scholars, no one anywhere who would doubt the authenticity or the authorship. That's how strong the evidence in favor of the gospel is. Bart Ehrman actually said this, and it's a long quote. Can you guys hang with the long quote? It's important. I think it'll make sense. All right. Bart Ehrman said this: "The writings of the New Testament, that in which the authors do identify themselves, given the genres in which this is typically done, letters, apocalypses, I will be arguing that the gospel writers saw themselves as writing in a genre that did not require a self-identification of an author." Then he goes on. "Then why did later writers of the Gospels identify their authors, falsely as it turned out? The answer is fairly clear and straightforward. Later Gospel writers were very intent," so these are the Gospel writers, the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Truth, so on. These later Gospel writers were very intent indeed on showing that their message, as opposed to the message of the other Gospels, was right, true, and apostolic, a message to be believed as authoritative. To provide an authoritative account for their own book in light of the fact that there were other books with other messages floating around, these later authors produced forgeries, claiming to be an apostle, Peter, James, Thomas, Philip, etc., when in fact they were not. That wasn't a problem with the early apostles. When Mark wrote his gospel, he felt no need to establish his book as opposed to other. It was apostolic. There were no others. So too, Matthew and Luke. They were continuing in a gospel tradition that started with Mark and was widely seen in their circles as authoritative, and so did not need to authorize their message by pretending to be an apostle when they were not. In John's case, the text is authorized. The author claims to be basing his account on the traditions passed on by the disciple Jesus loved. The author's own identity, note this, Bart Ehrman, skeptic of Christianity, skeptic of the resurrection, and so on, says this: "The author's own identity does not matter, only that of his source does." The fact that the author of John was an eyewitness, a disciple, an apostle. That quote there is coming from Bart Ehrman, who doesn't believe in the truthfulness of the Gospels, but here says that there's good evidence for the authorship of the Gospel, and part of that evidence, or part of the argument for this, is that there was no need. It was so well understood by the early church and those around who would have been reading these Gospels. It was so well understood, the authoritative nature of these Gospels, there was no need to attribute it. I think a very fascinating quote there from Ehrman. So finally, here's where we're going to wrap up. This is kind of drawing everything together. This is a timeline that J. Warner Wallace put together for his book, Cold Case Christianity, which is over there on the table if you'd like to take a look at it. Just highlighting some of the people and the number of books, the types of books that were affirmed and when, okay? So just highlighting here, we've got Mark, right, around AD 50. Again, J. Warner Wallace would take an early dating, as I do. So he's got Mark here. And this is, you can think of this as somewhat of a family tree, right? So as you go further to the right, you've got the disciples of disciples of disciples of disciples, and so on, going from Peter, John, and Paul here. So you've got Mark, who was then followed by Clement. Mark wrote the Memories of Peter, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Eusebius, all affirmed all four Gospels. Clement lived AD 50 to about 215, Origin 184 to 153, and then Eusebius 263 to 339. So you can see there's some overlap between most of them, and then you can see the others filling in the gaps. But these are kind of some of the more well-known church fathers who affirmed all four Gospels, who were disciples of Peter. And then you go to the Apostle John, who authored the Gospel. Then you've got Ignatius, who lived AD 35 to 110. He was a bishop, so he was actually born a couple years after Jesus left earth. He was a bishop, disciple of John. He affirmed Matthew and Luke and died as a martyr. He didn't say anything about Mark or the Gospel of John. He was just silent. There's no information we have, so neither affirming nor denying. Then you've got Polycarp, disciple of John and Ignatius, affirmed Matthew, Mark, and Luke, also died as a martyr, said nothing of John. Then you've got Irenaeus, who lived about 130 to 200. He was a disciple of Polycarp and affirmed all four Gospels. Hippolytus lived sometime around 170 to 235, disciple of Irenaeus, and affirmed all four Gospels. Then you jump down to the disciple of Paul, so you've got Paul there, and then Linus. Clement of Rome, so different than Clement of Alexandria. Clement of Rome roughly lived 35 to 100. He was a disciple of Paul and Peter and affirmed Mark and possibly Matthew or John. Scholars are unclear which text he may have been quoting from. And then we jump all the way over here. Justin Martyr lived 100 to 165. He affirmed all four Gospels. Would have been born just after, most scholars believe, John would have died. And then you've got Tatian, who had some interesting beliefs about Christianity. Kind of went off on his own with some of the gospel or with some of the doctrines that he affirmed. But he was a student for a time of Justin Martyr and also affirmed all four Gospels. And then you've got this Council of Laodicea, when they wrote their codex, or compiled their codex, I should say, happened a little bit later than some of these individuals. But as you can see, just with the people we've highlighted here, strong attestation or affirmation of the authoritative nature of the Gospels and indeed the authorship, whether it was apostolic, written by an apostle, or written by someone who learned from or spoke with the apostles. But listen to this. The writings of Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, who is not included on this chart, Hippolytus, and Eusebius, those 7 authors contain 19,468 citations from the four Gospels alone. Over 19,000 citations from the four Gospels. And they have an additional 16,921 citations from the rest of the New Testament, totaling over 36,000 citations from the four Gospel or from the New Testament from a mere 7 writers. Okay, you can see here in the little brackets underneath some of the names it says under Irenaeus 24 books, Clement 22 books. That's just indicating the number of books that they affirmed as part of the New Testament. So that's what that means. Eusebius has all 27 books that he affirmed, and so on. But you've got strong evidence for the early understanding of what constituted the New Testament that was then compiled in these councils, or it was collected into these codices by the councils. But they were simply relying on the work that many of these individuals already did, writing down who wrote what and who they talked to. So we've got a strong chain of custody, as J. Warner Wallace calls it, for the handing down of the New Testament books and the authorship. So there's the case, I think, that presents a strong or a reasonable argument for the authorship, for the reliability. And so then we have to ask, is there good evidence for the affirmation, apostolic affirmation of the Gospels? I would say yes. I think there's strong evidence. There's reasonable evidence that we can have confidence in and move forward confidently that the four Gospels should be included, are well established in their place in the New Testament. And then, as we're going to look at in later weeks, in the next few weeks, we're going to look at the issues of inerrancy and truthfulness of the words, but this work has to be done so that we can have confidence that the church hasn't been developing the idea of the deity of Christ or other doctrines like that are sometimes alleged to have developed very late. No, these are doctrines that were in the original books and affirmed as authoritative, as part of the New Testament by all these individuals. So hope you've enjoyed it. I sure enjoyed going through this. It's a lot of material. So we can dive into some questions. I will let you know there are only 2 questions that I can't answer. Those for which there is no answer, and those for which I don't know the answer. So with that, fire away.
Yeah, so there's some from online. So one is from a lot earlier, but Gary asks, are we assuming that Mark 19 or Mark 16, 9 to 20 are original, or would we agree that those verses were added later?
So the question is, are we arguing that the later portion of Mark is part of the original gospel or not? Is that the question?
I believe so. That's what they
Okay. Yeah.
Those specific verses, 11 verses.
I'm not making an argument either way for that. There's a lot of debate, and I'm not a New Testament scholar. I don't know the original languages. I wish I did, but I haven't been able to delve in deeply into that subject. That's not an argument that I made tonight. I simply made an argument for the evidence, the historical evidence for the Markian authorship of the gospel. There are some scholars who would say that those ending verses do not belong, that they were added at a later date. Even if that's the case, and I'm not taking a position here tonight on that, even if that's the case that someone else later added that portion of Scripture, that doesn't call into question the strong evidence that I presented here tonight for the authorship of the Gospel of Mark by John Mark, who was recording the memories or the teachings of Peter. That's the best I can do. I know it's not a satisfactory answer, but that's a huge topic that I'm just not well versed in.
And then Luke asks, so you were talking about the beloved disciple earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and he asked what the other gospels had to say about that.
Yeah, so the other gospels, I'm trying to think, in the study that I did prepping for tonight, I can't think of a verse. I don't believe there's a verse in any of the other gospels that refer to the beloved disciple. However, when you look at the other gospels, they reference they reference Peter, James, and John, or they reference a collection of disciples. I can look this up later if the person who's asking this wants to follow up with me. I could show them the references, but those Matthew, Mark, and Luke will present or record a number of disciples who were present at an event naming John. John will record similar events or similar instances and name the beloved disciple. The name of John is absent from those instances. So there's a strong suggestion there, looking at that evidence, that the beloved disciple and John are one and the same. John just simply not wanting to identify himself, potentially out of humility, potentially out of just not wanting to make himself the point of the gospel. Those would be some of the answers I'd give. Yeah.
This would be more a question of dating.
Okay.
How would you respond to somebody who would say that Mark 13, where Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple,
Mm-hmm.
isn't Mark reading the past event of the temple's actual destruction back into Jesus's teachings?
Yeah.
Like as if Mark saw the temple destroyed and then decided that he would make Jesus out to be a prophet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if I understand the question, you're asking Mark 13, I believe Matthew also talks about the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
could it, or isn't it the case that Mark wasn't written early? Mark was actually writing his gospel after the destruction of the temple, and in order to make Jesus look like a prophet, attributed those things. A couple things on that point. One, that position, that objection, generally assumes that supernatural prophecy is impossible. There's a presupposition there that prophecy is not a thing that actually happens, supernaturally revealed to a person by God, and therefore it's impossible to predict the future with such level of accuracy. So there's a presupposition there that I think would need to be addressed before you could move on and fully address the text. If there's a resistance to the supernatural, then of course, or if supernatural prophecy is impossible, then of course it had to have been written after, or it provides, I'd say, very strong evidence that it was maybe written after the destruction of the temple. But between Matthew and Mark, there are some differences. Mark is fairly vague in the writing. If Mark had had a knowledge of the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, there's not very good reason that scholars can identify why he would have been so incredibly vague. Right? If the temple was destroyed, wouldn't it have been easy to say, and Jesus said the temple will be destroyed, and then it was in this date by these people. Instead, he talks very vaguely, similar to many of the other parables that Jesus told, or the other prophecies or teachings of Jesus where they were intentionally veiled or vague to be understood at a later date. First is the presupposition against supernatural prophecy, the resistance against that even being possible. It's probably where the objection might arise from. So I would tackle that, and then look at why would Mark be so vague? Because if supernatural prophecy is possible, then vague language looking forward to the future is understandable or plausible. Same argument roughly goes for Matthew as well. The bulk of the objection for early dating of both Matthew and Mark rely heavily on a resistance against prophecy. So, yeah.
Kind of following on from the destruction of the temple point. So, yeah, some of the case for dating, let's say Acts, Luke, and then therefore Mark or Matthew prior to AD 70 that they don't mention as a monumental event.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say, yeah, that seems likely. What if we could make a case that the purpose of those books was not, mentioning that wouldn't have served their purpose? In other words, the books were meant to write a history of the life of Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
So using the Katrina example, let's say the purpose of writing my book was to write a 20th century history of New Orleans. Well, in that case, it would make total sense that I'm not mentioning Katrina because the
Sure.
scope of my writing, that event happened after. Destruction of the temple happens 40 years after Jesus, died. So why would it be relevant to mention it in a book whose scope is not necessarily indicative of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question, if those of you online didn't hear, is essentially maybe the destruction of the temple and other events like that were intentionally left out or not important to the purpose of the writing of the book. Is that fair?
That's fair.
And so then that could suggest a later dating, or would that be?
Yeah,
the
I'm just
argument,
saying,
or-
like, why is it? It's not as conclusive that
Sure.
it could be that it had been written before he said, and therefore they didn't mention it. But it also could have been that it maybe just wasn't something that they felt
Okay.
relevant to
Yeah.
mention.
That could be the case, and I think that is why some scholars do take a later dating position, because they're not convinced by that the work that you do to say Acts didn't include these events, Luke was written before Acts, Luke relies on Mark's writing, therefore Mark was written at this particular date.
Yeah.
There are scholars who simply aren't convinced by that line of reasoning, and so they do take a later date. In that case, we're still talking a difference of 20 to 40 years. So not significant when we're looking at documents that were written 2,000 years ago, roughly. And certainly not well, okay, I won't say certainly. I would say not very strong evidence to then argue convincingly that myths, legends, mistellings, misremembering were introduced into the Gospels in those 20 to 30 years that it might have been.
Yeah. It's kind of
So it's possible that the destruction of the temple or something like that wasn't part of the reason, or wasn't helpful to the point that the author was trying to make. However, I will push back on that a little bit, because Luke sets out to write Theophilus an orderly account. He's very detailed, very thorough in his chronology, and highlights the missionary the missionary travels of Paul, Peter, and others, but Paul and Peter specifically. The ending of Acts is fairly abrupt in that it leaves Peter in jail, it leaves Paul in prison, and then the book's over. It seems to be the case that it would have been smart. I don't know, not calling into question Luke's intelligence, but it would have made a lot of sense to kind of round out the story. Here's the history of the early church. Here's what Paul did. Here's how he helped the early church. And then I'm just going to leave off the fact that he was martyred for his faith.
I guess McDowell tries to advance the argument that the reason that Luke cuts off so abruptly is that his thesis statement is in Acts 1:8. Well, the gospel will go from Jerusalem through Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth. And so when Paul gets to Rome, that's kind of indicative of the gospel reaching the ends of the earth, and it just stops. Not that I don't necessarily hold that thesis myself.
Sure, I think that's a reasonable explanation. I think even if you maybe lessen the weightiness of that argument, there's still compelling evidence for the authorship and the dating.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite as convincing, but still it's quite strong.
Yeah, the other thing I think about that, or does somebody else have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
I was just going to question, who's that, McDowell?
Yeah.
With the idea that Rome was the ends of the earth. You have back in, what's his face, Jonah, traveling to Tarshish, which is a lot further west than Rome.
Yeah.
And yet,
Well, yeah,
the idea
literal,
that the gospel has reached the ends of the earth. I mean, Hebrews of the time would have been aware that there was a lot more earth past that.
Well, yeah, not the literal end of the earth, but I was trying to, in a colloquial way of saying, it got to the end of the earth. It got to Rome, and from Rome, at the time, Rome is the pinnacle of that area of the world. Everything is disseminated from Rome, if you will. That was the argument. I'm just.
This is fair.
Yeah. Good. Plausible discussion on both. I think there was an understanding that it was probably a colloquialism to a certain extent, but also, there was a certain recognition. I think at that point, Great Britain had been discovered by the Romans, or right around that time. So, any other questions here? Sure, go for it.
About the pericopes quote.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand what that meant, and the reason I did is because.
I'll go back to it here.
The Christian one? Yeah. So we started out with the statement that Mark, and I think it was Papias who made the statement that Mark's not an orderly account, Mark is kind of scattered. But it seems like this guy is saying, okay, but when Mark has any sort of chronology, then Matthew and Luke never deviate from it, which would be odd to me if we're starting out with the premise that Mark is not chronological, or at least not in every detail is it chronological. The overall arch, sure, but every detail. But then we say, well, here Matthew and Luke never agree in chronology or against Mark. Kind of seems to be aware of it, making that they would trust his chronology. If then we're saying it's also not chronological. Is the pericope? Is he saying that chronology in a grand sense is what they don't deviate from, or chronology in like the sense of within this story, the order of events in this story or this episode, that's the chronology they don't disagree from? I'm just trying to understand what this guy is saying.
As I understand it, so It took me a while to understand or think I understand this quote myself. As I understand it, we're talking chronology in a general sense. So when we're looking at the rough order of events in Mark, other Gospels, Luke, I think especially, John as well, will use terms like then, or Mark says things like immediately after that, indicating there's a succession of moments happening here, that this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Mark seems to jump around, and that's fairly agreed on by scholars both for and against the early dating. What Lockman is I believe saying here is that in a general sense, if he was arguing, as I understand it, against the Q document or the theory of a Q document or some extra biblical source that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all agreed on or all used to write their Gospels, and he's saying here, if there was this other theoretical document in existence that they used, then it would seem to be the case that at least sometimes Matthew and Mark, their order of events, would agree against Mark, or I'm sorry, Matthew and Luke would agree against Mark, because Mark would have copied different things or felt important different things, and we don't see that happening.
Okay, so it's more an argument for their material is sourced in Mark.
Yes.
Than it
Yes.
is, okay, that they're necessarily always trusting Mark's chronology.
Correct.
In its
Yep.
entirety.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's an inference from the evidence we have.
Yeah.
Yep. Good question though.